Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 11 of environmental law. And today we're going to be talking about two of the toxic, well, about toxic cleanup and responsibility for that. And the main statute we're going to be talking about is CERCLA. So let me get there. So CERCLA, it's also called Superfund, and then SARA, which is really just amendments to CERCLA in the 80s, and then EPCRA is the Emergency Planning Community Resources Act, which is actually authorized from CERCLA as well. So that's what we're going to cover today. It's Chapter 10, and it's about cleaning up this toxic waste. So, if we talk about William Shatner and Star Trek, if we can clean up our world, we can achieve warp drive. So this is I'm very terrible at remembering the full name of CERCLA, but it's Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. So this is a lot later than these other environmental statutes that we've been dealing with. This was enacted in 1980, and it's really to deal with cleaning up existing sites. So sites that had been contaminated in the past or are currently being contaminated or become at risk because of some failure. So we have these toxic waste sites, and how do we clean them up so that they are no longer a threat to our health and our environment? And we have to figure out how to pay for that and who pays for that. So that's a big part of CERCLA. Okay, and then we've talked in the past about things that lead up to the enacting of these statutes. We talked earlier on when we were talking about environmental justice, the Love Canal disaster up in upstate New York, and then there was a big chemical waste fire in New Jersey in 1977 that kind of started about it. And super important, and this is a quiz question. This statute is retroactive. So if the waste was generated and stored before the statute was enacted, or when the way they stored it initially was legal at the time, that doesn't matter. It applies retroactively. Okay, so that's kind of a key part of it. So if we have waste that was dumped in the 60s, people are still responsible for it now. SARA are these amendments which authorize that EPCRA, which we'll talk about at the end of the class, and just added some enforcement authorities and some specific stuff. So it's kind of a part of it. It's amendments. It made CERCLA better. So there's some terms that we're going to deal with. Release. CERCLA involves cleaning up after a release of toxic waste. So release is, again, broadly defined: spilling, leaking, pouring, emitting. So that would be, something gaseous: emptying, discharging, injecting, escaping, leaching. So that's like into the groundwater, or seeping out, dumping, abandoning of any hazardous chemical, extremely hazardous, there should be a comma there, extremely hazardous substance or any hazardous substance into the environment. Okay, so if it got there, okay, there are exclusions. Exhaust engines, right? We're working on that with Clean Air Act and emissions regulations, right? Anything nuclear, we're not saying nuclear escape, release isn't hazardous or isn't important. It just is dealt with by another statute. In addition, fertilizer workplace, so that would be under OSHA, or if there is a special federal permit. And there's another exclusion from this too, which is the petroleum exclusion, which we'll talk about in a slide or two. Okay, so CERCLA, these hazardous substances, there is a list, which we'll talk about in CERCLA, or in the Code of Federal Regulations. that are tell you what the hazardous substances are, contaminants. Similarly, facility. Okay, so it's what is a facility? Buildings, equipments, stationary items. Okay, so that's what the facility is, and the vessel. So it's from that's anything used on water to transport. Okay, so that's we talk about that. Okay, so if CERCLA defines something as hazardous and it is released, see the slide below, in any quantity, then CERCLA kicks in. Okay, then and it imposes liability on individuals who have owned the property or have been responsible for that waste in some point. Okay, so they impose liability for cleanup. They call about one of the things that is important in CERCLA is what is a reportable quantity. Um, at what point do you have to notify the EPA that something has been released? Okay, so or we've talked about what are these releases? Say you have storage tanks that have been sitting somewhere for a while and they start wearing away or decomposing or failing. You have a big flood or rain, some rain water gets in and substances have moved from one place or another. Maybe nothing has happened yet, but because of things like, where they're stored, deteriorating, there's a threat of that. Workers unknowingly carrying substances home. So that is in that one your homework questions in that Kowalski case. That is a case of that. And then the res ipsa loquitur theory, that's, we don't know where it's happening from, but it's releasing and it's the same chemical you're using in that plant. So that means, the thing in of itself is res ipsa loquitur. So that is included as a part, even if you don't know where specifically it's coming from, you know that it's released and you know that it's either on your property or chemicals that they're using in that plant. That then you're like, okay, well, it's from you. We don't know how, but it's from you. Okay, so hazardous substances are listed in the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, I have this link here. You're probably not going to be able to see it very well, but you on your own time can go into the CFR and look at the list of these hazardous substances. So things like toxic stuff, anything hazardous. We haven't gone through RCRA or TSCA yet, but they kind of list certain substances that would be included in CERCLA. Okay, and I talked earlier about a petroleum exclusion. So that is excluded from CERCLA. So if it's just, oil or petroleum that has leaked, it's not CERCLA. So think of like the Exxon Valdez, right? That spill in the waters. So that's under a different statute. Okay. If it's exclusively that. So if it's that and other hazardous chemicals, yeah, CERCLA kicks in. So if the particular components of petroleum are also excluded. So again, if it's just an oil spill, it's not CERCLA. But if it's an oil spill plus, then CERCLA will kick in. What is, so we have those hazardous substances, and then we talk about these pollutants and contaminants. And those are, again, broadly defined. So something which would be harmful to human health. But EPA doesn't have as much authority with those substances as with those hazardous ones on the CERCLA list in the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, we have more about exclusions, right? We talked about that on the first page, including, but it's from a stationary source. Okay, so we have exclusions from vehicles, aircraft, and vessel emissions, nuclear releases, and fertilizer application. So moving releases aren't included. Um, and those threats of releases. So, you have a location, I don't know, near it's like there's an impending hurricane or a flood or corroded tanks, things are bad, then EPA also is given power over those. Um, oh, well, I guess it says vessel is, aircraft vessels. So it's kinds of release that are covered are, you know, site or facility releases and vessel releases. Okay, so those kinds of releases into the environment um, are covered by CERCLA. Okay, so the EPA can act if there is a release or that substantial threat of a release of a hazardous substance um, covered under that list, or release or threat of release of one of these hazardous pollutants or contaminants that present an imminent, right? So it's actually going to happen. It's not hypothetical, a danger to public health or welfare. So see, this is kind of like, yes, no matter whether or not it's imminent threat one from one of those hazardous substances under CERCLA, yeah, EPA kicks in. I mean, CERCLA kicks in and the EPA has authority. But for these pollutants or contaminants, they have to present this, clear and present, this is going to happen, danger to the public health or welfare. Okay, so it kicks in. So what does EPA do? Um, they do remediation is kind of the term there. So there's two different options. The EPA can go in and do a cleanup, and then they go back and figure out who has to pay for it. Okay, so they clean up and they seek recovery of that cleanup cost, or if it's maybe not so dangerous at this point and they've discovered the site, but they know it has to be cleaned up, the EPA will identify what they call potentially responsible parties, PRPs, and they have to clean up the site and pay for it. Okay, and then we're going to talk a bit about PRPs in a sec. Okay, so the National Contingency Plan. So, presumably we've got like hundreds or thousands of sites that maybe need cleanup for these hazardous substances under CERCLA. But the EPA can't do that all the time, right? It's they have to prioritize which ones are the most important. Okay, so this is the National Contingency Plan, is the plan to address how are they going to respond to these releases of hazardous substances. Okay, it existed before CERCLA, but then they straightened it up and incorporated it into CERCLA when CERCLA was passed. Okay, so it talks about who's involved in the release and what's the response and cleanup, right? Who's in charge, figures out what the appropriate response is for each individual site. What are the procedures? Are you going to remove? Are you going to remediate? There's going to be eventually a record for each site, like an art record of decision, right? Format. And then what the important thing it does here is it creates this national priorities list. Okay, so the national priorities list, as I said before, right? There's all of these sites. Which ones are they going to address? Well, that's what it does. It figures out which ones go on this national priorities list, and then they are going to, figure out which ones they're going to do. Okay, so every year the EPA revisits their priority list. Are there new sites going on there? Are there sites that are fixed, that are off that? And Superfund, which is the money that is allocated for the EPA cleanup of these sites, is only available. That money is only available to sites on the national priorities list. Okay, so basically, like, you can't, unless it's one of these like dire, immediate emergency situations, the EPA doesn't act unless the site is on the national priorities list. So the national priorities list is pretty important. So what do? We figured out there's a release. It's on my priorities, on the EPA priorities list. What does the EPA do? Okay, there's two, different categories of this. There's removal. Okay, so this is if one of these like imminent or a spill that was potentially affecting people, quickly, right? It's an emergency. Okay, they have to contain these hazardous substances and reduce the risk to the public. Okay, so for removal, this is, if we're not even at the point where this site can be on the NPL because it's like an emergency. Okay, so they're really just, it says removal, but they're removing what they have to. They're containing it to eliminate the immediate danger to the public. Okay, remediation is a longer process. Okay, so that's your permanent solution for a site. So again, it would have to be on the NPL. May take many years to complete. So you might have to like dig out soil. You might have to cover things. Might have to have trenches. You might have to add other chemicals to neutralize these hazardous substances. That's all science, which I'm unfamiliar with. So if we're in a remediation situation, so the site would be on the NPL. The EPA is going to identify the potentially responsible parties as soon as possible to avoid their out of pocket, right? So that's remediation. Oh, so here's an example. This is like what it looks like, right? Are you going to see this in your neighborhood? So now I'm going to cut this video off, and in the module there is something called like Superfund activity, where it's basically I have a link to the EPA site for you to see if there's a Superfund site near your where you live, and if not, find something close enough, figure out like what chemicals, what's the release, what's the status, and report that to me, because this is just stuff that affects us all. Okay, so do that and then come back, and you can start on video 2.